Happy Friday, everyone. I'm Bandish, founder of The Curious Mindset, a private community for technology leadership teams powered by 64 Tech, an IT solutions provider of hardware, cloud, and IT services. Although we're powered by 64 Tech, our core principle is simple: to always give more than we take. There are no membership fees, no catches, just a shared commitment to growth. And rest assured, this community prioritizes people over pictures. You won't be bombarded with any sales. Please do follow our dedicated LinkedIn page to stay updated on how 64 Tech can support you with any technology challenges. Or feel free to contact me directly if you're looking to shake things up with your current IT suppliers. While 64 Tech delivers technology solutions, the hardest challenges about running a technology department is not the technology itself, but rather the human elements. There's pressure to appear all-knowing, which makes it difficult to admit what we don't know or ask questions that allow us all to be vulnerable. That's precisely why the Curious Mindset exists. For any new members joining us today, this is a space where we combine coaching, mentorship, and community to help technology leaders grow. We focus on three key areas. Firstly, individual impact, helping you grow personally and professionally, especially if you don't have traditional support. Secondly, team impact, strengthening your leadership to improve team performance and results. And finally, community. Leadership can be isolating, so we're here to connect you with others walking the same path. This community grew out of my own experience and desire to help others overcome the same struggles I faced as a new leader. I know how challenging that journey can be, and our North Star remains: no one leads alone. At 64 Tech, the mantra is together we grow, and the Curious Mindset is how we can bring that to life. Our mission: to help technology leaders become the best versions of themselves. Now, before we dive in, a quick favor. The Curious Mindset grows organically through invitation and reputation. And honestly, one of our biggest struggles is that most technology leaders don't realize they need a community like this until they experience it. So if you believe in what we're building and want to support, here are 4 simple ways to help. Firstly, hit the bell icon on our LinkedIn page. Select all so you never miss a post. Secondly, leave a quick Google review. It takes under a minute, but makes a huge difference. Thirdly, if our team reach out asking for a LinkedIn recommendation, we'd really appreciate it. And finally, please, please, please invite other technology leaders by sharing our website. There's a short form on there to join. Bryony will also send you a quick email which you can forward on. In return, my commitment to you is this: I'll do everything I can, together with the team, to make this better, fortnight after fortnight. We'll keep listening to your feedback and shaping this around what matters to you the most. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers: our resident host, Andy McMenemy, our technology leader co-host, Steve Maxwell, and our special guest, Tim Spiker.
Bandish, thank you so much. And as always, thank you for the 5 years of commitment and investment that you've put into the Curious Mindset. This would not exist without your benevolence, without your generosity, and without your massively continuing support. So we really do appreciate your efforts in growing the community from its very early stages to know that in 2025, it's only going to thrive and grow greater through the efforts of everybody involved, not least of all our fantastic speakers. And it is my absolute privilege today to introduce Tim Spiker, the author of The Only Leaders Worth Following. And Tim also has a leadership development business called Aperio, which is very apt because Aperio apparently in Latin means to open, to uncover, to reveal, and to make clear. And I'm so excited and so curious to understand what Tim is going to make clear today about the principle that 77% of leadership is inside out. Tim, a very warm welcome to the Curious Mindset.
Andy, thank you very much. Glad to be digitally traveling across the pond here to be with everybody.
It's good to see you. Tim, I'm so excited to hear your subject. I know a little bit from the preamble chat we had, but I'm sure the audience are going to love this today. So talk to us about the principle of the 77%, Tim.
Yeah. So a number of years ago, I had a chance to be a part of a consulting practice that ended up doing some research. And given our audience today, it's probably worth me mentioning from the very beginning that I'm an electrical engineer by education. So I will admit that the world is a safer place because I am not a practicing engineer. But what that means is I love data. I love charts and graphs and digging in. You know, a good story helps us move something forward, but is it grounded in truth? Is it grounded in reality? Is it something more than just a story? And so this research gets me excited in the fact that it wasn't just me taking my finger, stick it in the wind one day and say, hey, I think it's roughly this. So here's how things unfolded. We had a leadership development experience on the west side of Pikes Peak, which is central here in the United States in Colorado, up in the mountains. And we would bring leaders to that location and have a week-long experience with them. The very beginning of that, we gave them a series of assessments, personality assessments. We tested some natural abilities, and we had a leadership 360 where people got feedback from their boss, their peers, their subordinates. And we were wondering, because we kept getting the question from our clients, what's the magic mix? If I have a particular personality style, some particular natural abilities, does that mean I'm going to be better at any aspect or maybe leadership overall? And so we ran the statistical analysis on this. And my colleague, Vanessa Kiley, she was the one with her fingers on the keyboard making SPSS software do its thing. And I went into her office one night because she said, I have the results. And so I went in very curiously and said, what do we have? And here's what she said. Your screen is not frozen. She said absolutely nothing. There was no statistical correlation at all between personality, natural ability, and leadership performance. So she looked and searched around our hypothesis and could not find any correlation. And I got up to leave her office and she said, but I did find something where we weren't looking. And so that piqued my curiosity. I turned around and said, what are you talking about? And she had basically run out of ideas. We're looking for everything that we think that we might find, and we're finding nothing. So, in an act of desperation, she just said, please find any correlation at all that you can possibly find in all of this data. And that's when the very unexpected thing was revealed. We were measuring people in 8 aspects of leadership on the 360. And what that data set said to her, and now to us that I share with you, is that don't worry about personality. Not that it's not important, but there's no statistical correlation regarding leadership. Don't worry about these natural abilities. These wasn't natural leadership ability. It was skills, even down to the idea of how many numbers can I memorize in a line. And so that's what we mean by natural ability. There's nothing there that correlates to better leadership. But in our leadership 360, there were 8 aspects of leadership that we were measuring. And what that analysis found is that just 2 of those 8 areas were driving 77% of the variability on the entire assessment, which means you would, if you just think about a round cut pizza, if you divide it up equally, you've got 8 slices. They would all be equal sized. But what this says is the pizza of leadership that we had is that we're 2 pizzas that were together combining for 77%, 3/4 of the pizza. Those are the pieces of pizza that my 15-year-old son would go after, and the rest of us would have to, we'd have to get the little parts that are left over. So all of that to say, if you're leaning in a little bit, like which were the 2? And those 2 were inwardly sound and others focused. And if you think, well, that doesn't sound like the typical leadership activities, then you're hearing it exactly correctly. What I learned 3 years later, because it took me that long to figure it out, so I might be, you might respect me a little bit less after you hear this part of the story, but I was sitting in my office. We knew it was important. We were still learning about what it actually meant. But I stepped back from it one day and I said, oh, it just kind of jumped out at me. It had been there all along. Inwardly sound and others focus were different than the typical things. The other things in there were set direction, think strategically, execute and follow through, motivate and inspire, develop talent, those kinds of things. And then I realized all those things that I just said, those are what leaders do. But inwardly sound and others focused, that's who we are as people. And so that was the big bottom line, that 3/4 of our effectiveness as leaders comes from who we are, not what we do. And I have been testing that statistical reality with leaders literally around the world for the last 20 years, and it just keeps holding time and time again. And so we invite people into that conversation about this idea that we call the who, not what principle.
The who, not what
The
principles.
who, not what principle. Yeah. Ultimately,
Okay.
just summarizing all of it. Of course, there's lots of paths that we're going to get to discuss and go down around that today. But
Sure.
in the end, understanding that how well developed we are as human beings is an enormous impact on our effectiveness as leaders. And therefore, when we're thinking about growing and developing, as Bandish was just talking about, so the purpose of the community here, when we think about that, if we want to be the best leaders that we can be for a variety of reasons, we have to be talking about how well developed we are as human beings.
I guess that covers emotional intelligence. It covers a whole raft of things, communication, etc. All of the
Yes.
normal tenets of leadership. Others focused. We'll cover that, I'm fairly sure. But
Yeah.
take us on a bit of a deep dive then, Tim. Go into the inwardly
Yeah.
sound. What does that look like? What are the concept parts of it?
Yeah. So let's just start with those two words and then we'll dig a little bit deeper. But I actually want to start with the second word. Let's start with the word sound. What does it mean for something to be sound? The image that comes to my mind when I hear that word is that of a boat heading out to sea. If we get on that boat and we start to go out, I can assure you that one of the things we're all going to want is for that boat to be sound. It means that it is put together with quality components that have strength and integrity to them. They're not going to fail. But even more than that is the connectors. What's holding this thing together? Is there a solidness? Is it screwed together in every way that we would want it to be? Why? So that when we get out there into the rough waters, that we know that the vessel can take a beating and still be stable for everybody that's on board.
And
Now,
I guess
just
in your engineering world, Tim, that would be integrity, wouldn't it? The
yes,
integrity
it
of the
would.
structure.
Yeah, yeah. You can talk about structural integrity. That's right. Well, just take that same idea and now apply it to a person.
Right.
Who are the people who are not easily shaken? They're grounded in who they are. A lot of things can come at them, but they can handle it. Now, I'm not saying that they're not emotive. I want to be careful here because emotional intelligence is not that that I am just stoic at all times. We have different personalities around emotion, and some of us are more emotive than others. But the emotional health that I'm talking about here really has to do more with what's going on the inside, how spun up, because I mean there are probably many of us that have been a tornado on the inside but held it together on the outside. The reality is in those moments we're still rather compromised as leaders. We're just doing a good job of maybe not creating a career limiting move externally, but this has a lot to do with the inner health of the individual. The opposite is true too. I can be very emotive but also very grounded because I'm not just reacting and going crazy. All that to say, this idea of a sound vessel is, I think, it's kind of the bedrock or foundation of what does it mean to be inwardly sound. I am somebody that you can count on if I am an inwardly sound person. And you can begin to think, I just encourage people as we're talking about this today, who are the leaders that you follow that you would say, oh, that's an inwardly sound person? They don't get easily thrown off. When everything's hitting the fan, I could go to them and they are like a port in the storm. Pardon the additional boat analogy there. But who are the people that we can count on because they have done the work to create stability within themselves? So if we go just one step further, we begin to look at things like what does it mean to be secure and settled, which is in many ways just the opposite of being insecure. And of course, imposter syndrome comes up in places like that where we talk about how do we move past that voice in our head that's telling us that we're not enough, and in most cases is lying. Self-awareness is a big part of being inwardly sound. What does it mean to be principled? One of the things that we get into conversations with leaders about is as we talk about what does it mean to be principled, it's very easy to say, yeah, I got that one. But when you really dig into the pieces of what does it mean to be a principled leader, there's a lot more gray in life as we get older. It was real simple when we were 8 in grammar school, but when you get to be in the working world, there's a little more gray. And what does it mean to show up at the highest level? Holistically healthy. How am I taking care not just of my physical health, but my mental health, my relational health, even I would say my financial health. Some of us have been in situations when our financial house was challenged and upside down. Think about how that affected everything that you went with out into the world. So, holistically healthy is the whole story of health. And then finally, purposeful. Am I clear about what I am up to, why I am taking breath, why I'm getting out of the bed in the morning and putting one foot down in front of the other? Am I clear on what I'm here for? When you combine all of those things along with the emotional maturity we were talking about earlier, that is the big picture of what we're talking about with being inwardly sound.
I guess having a a clearly defined purpose as a leader, Tim, and knowing who we are, um,
Yes.
is probably the foundation piece. And some people do struggle with that, right? I'm reminded instantly of an African quote that said, "If there is no enemy within, the enemy outside can do us no harm." And I guess
Mhm.
that's back to being sound and knowing who you are, knowing what you stand for, your purpose, your and consistently charting that path, right?
Absolutely. I mean, what a wonderful saying that is, and it really gets back to the core idea about being inwardly sound. If I can take care of the things within me, then I can be more grounded and ready to do the other half of the equation, which is others focused. In a more kind of in a not very refined way. One of the things that we say is that if we as leaders don't deal with our crap, the people we lead will have to.
Sure.
And so ultimately, we want to be the kinds of leaders who are willing to dig into some challenging questions about who we are and what we're about so that we can be inwardly sound leaders for the sake of others.
Because I guess when those others are looking at us in difficult times, and in business we face difficult times, we have difficult decisions to make.
Yes.
We have courageous conversations we must have, in order to address behavioral issues or to address underperformance. So in all of those areas, we need to be consistent and congruent as leaders with who we are inside. And because those other people are looking at us as well, we've
That's
got
right.
to realize that we are a role model, right?
Well, 100% we're a role model. And look, these kinds of things can feel like a burden. And to a certain extent, I get that. But they're also an opportunity. If I just kind of take a step back to the larger picture of leadership, you just think about the idea, the significance of that, what is the impact that leaders have on our lives every day? And all we have to do is look at our own lives to understand the answer to that question.
Mm.
Leaders are in an incredibly influential space. They make our lives challenging in the worst ways, or maybe challenging in the best ways. To have that level of influence with somebody, to say, how many waking hours do we spend at work, away from our family and friends? What does it mean to make that really count for somebody so that they look at it as a fulfilling experience? And I don't mean that it's always going to be easy. Some of the most fulfilling things any of us have done have been incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging. And I think that we all understand it isn't about just how do I make everything nice and easy all the time. But the opportunity that somebody would come into your orbit as a leader, and then they would leave, whenever that is, however that is, and say, "Thank goodness I got a chance to, if there were, thank goodness I got a chance to follow Andy. I can't
Mhm.
believe how that impacted me personally, what we accomplished, how I grew. I can't even believe how it impacted my family, the fact that I was following Andy." That is the opportunity we have when we have the role and the title of leader, is we get to influence people's lives, and that goes well beyond work. And the way that we know that, all the very best leaders that we have ever followed, we know that their impact went throughout our entire life, not just our work life. So it's a tremendous opportunity. Even as it's a big challenge to work on these kinds of things, it's also a tremendous opportunity.
Tim, when I reflect back on my 22-year corporate career, I'm just listening to the words you're saying there. And in my mind, images were flashing past of leaders that I respected, and the conversations they had with me, which were sometimes they were quite challenging conversations
Yeah.
where they were telling me kind of truths that I needed to hear. And I wasn't necessarily listening, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they made me listen because they had a vested interest in me. And I always felt better walking away from the conversation because of how they made me feel, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
And
and I
I
and
And
Yes.
I can remember every leader that didn't do that and did
I was
things.
going to say, there's the other side of that, right? You had some other faces that went through your mind and were like, yeah, I remember that one too. Here's what's really interesting about that. When we think about the who, not what principle, it applies to both the great and the horrible leaders. The leaders that were worst for us in our lives are also the worst because of who they were to us, how they showed up. That three quarters principle applies to the bad leaders the same way it does to the good leaders. And that's something for us to maybe gives us a little pause to think about as well as we lean into doing the hard work of becoming a well-developed human being.
Yeah, that sits very well with a quote that I read. I think it was attributed to Jamie Wheal of the flow movement,
Okay.
where he said that people primarily in business are looking for three things. They're looking for something to believe in that they can get their energy behind. They're looking
Mhm.
for someone to believe in, a leader that they can trust and has that core integrity, but also more importantly, someone who will believe in them. And I
Yeah.
guess that leads us into the others focused, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Well, nice transition, Andy. That was good. Absolutely. Yeah, and ultimately, when you think about being inwardly sound, coming back to that, there's a question that follows that, and that is for the sake of what? Now, I would love for everybody to have that grounded piece within themselves because I think it makes a better life for us. But in the leadership space, being inwardly sound is the foundation that helps us then turn around and be others focused. So, a couple of things that I mentioned there around inwardly sound, secure and settled, the opposite of that being insecure. Just imagine following an insecure leader. Probably for many people on the call, you don't have to imagine it. You lived it and you knew what that was like. And for most people, that was a pretty painful experience. One of the challenges is that insecure leaders, people who do not feel comfortable in their own skin and at peace about what the future may bring, people who live in that space, they're pretty terrible to follow because the unspoken purpose of the department who is following the insecure leader is to help them feel more secure. And there's no possibility for really insecure leaders to be others focused. So just to make the point that how inwardly sound actually enables others focus, there's a relationship there. But that is what it is for ultimately in a leadership space. For the sake of what? I want to be inwardly sound so that I can, in an undistracted and unfettered way, serve and care for the people I'm leading. And so what does that look like? What does it look like to be others focused? Well, there's one word in here that everybody here is going to be really, really familiar with, and that's the word curious. What does it mean to be a leader who's curious, but also attentive? As we talk about technology leadership and we think about these devices that we carry around with us, the idea of being attentive to others is not only about technology, but that's a big part of the conversation in today's day and age. Empathic. What does it mean to have empathy for the people that you're leading? Humility is this quality in leaders that we love to follow leaders who are humble. Some people sometimes get confused and they'll equate humility with a lack of confidence. I would argue with that. I would say it is completely possible, and I challenge you. Think about the people in your lives. There are people who you know who are both confident and humble. Humility does not mean that I think less of myself, as the old C.S. Lewis quote goes, that not thinking less of myself, but thinking of myself less. We love following those kinds of leaders. And then finally, to pull, we used a little Latin earlier. We'll put a little Greek in now. The word that we use is agapone, and some that's translation is to be in a state of loving others. And I get that it starts to get uncomfortable for some people in the business space to use that word. English language is limited, so the Greek is better here. And here's how I'll frame that so we don't all think I've got to go call HR if we talk about this much longer. The definition would be that I'm going to serve and care for others consistently and unconditionally. Now, unconditionally doesn't mean that I give the keys of the safe to the thief. What it means is I'm going to have respect and regard for you, even if you're not acting respectable. In other words, I'm going to do this. If you're a control freak, you love Agapone because the other person doesn't get to determine how you show up. So that final idea is, and there's kind of a build there on others focused. Attentive helps me to be more curious. Being more curious helps me to be more empathic. When I'm more curious and empathic, there's actually a direct connection to being humble as I show up curious saying, I don't know everything, and I show up empathic saying, I'm not the only one that matters. Once we unlock humility to say, okay, wait, this whole thing isn't about me. Now I'm able to lean into that idea of really serving and caring for others because they matter. And so there's a build here on the other side, on others focused, that's a little bit different than inwardly sound, but it all leads to, ultimately, it leads to engagement. And that's why it makes a difference from a leadership standpoint.
And I guess ultimately that's all about unlocking their potential, isn't it? Because we believe in them and we're showing that we care.
Yeah, how do I move as I'm leading people from the have to the want to?
Mm.
Ultimately, and that's called, that's the idea of how do we tap into that discretionary effort. We all know that there's space in between what I do to keep my job and what I do to excel at my job. And the people who get that space, and I mean this in the best possible way, not in a manipulative way, but the people we give that to willingly are inwardly sound and others focused. And that's ultimately how this ends up showing up in the results of leadership, not just a nice story about it.
And that is the magic dust, isn't it? Discretionary effort is the I guess the goal that we're all looking for as leaders, where our teams go over and above and beyond because of who we are and because of their respect and their admiration for how we lead them, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's a methodology, you could say, but I think that probably undersells it a little bit because
Mm.
it's much deeper than that. One of the things is we're visiting with our clients that we tell them, and this is going to sound a little bit odd at first, but we tell them, we're not interested in you learning anything, but we will crawl over broken glass to help you become something.
Mm.
And the reality is discretionary effort, that tapping into that, it really comes along with us as leaders becoming the very best that we're able to be as human beings. That's the thing that draws out. I was in a room once with folks and we were talking about the difference between motivation, inspiration, and manipulation. And people had a lot of different ideas, but what they ultimately communicated, regardless of which word they used, is that people got the best of them when they saw them as, to what you were saying a moment ago, when they saw them as somebody to believe in.
Mm.
And we have never fully believed in somebody that was not able to be well grounded in who they are, that was pushed about by whatever. And it's also really hard to believe in somebody who's just for themselves. And so when we take those two things off the table and say, okay, grounded and for others, that person is motivational, not in the rah-rah speech kind of way, but in the just showing up every single day. That's the kind of person I want to give my very best effort to and for.
Mm. I love that. I love that. So where do you get your inspiration from when it comes to this sort of stuff, Tim? Who do you look for as examples of that exemplary leadership?
Well, there's so many different places to pull on from that. And even though I spend the most of my time, if not all, in the business space, there are other places where I draw some inspiration from, and I see leaders that are, in my opinion, completely worth following. So I'll share three here.
Hmm.
One is a gentleman, and this, ironically, I just set it up as a non-business, and then I'm going to give you a business example. A gentleman named Mike Kane, and this one's very personal. It's probably not somebody that a lot of folks on the call would know, but Mike is somebody I personally had the opportunity to follow for a time period in my career. He went on to lead a multinational company based out of Australia, and this was a person incredibly smart, incredibly gifted, but at the end of the day, he was for you. And I just saw him time and time again be for people. And what's really interesting is when you're in those big business, publicly traded type of situations, a lot of times you're going through step changes, whether it be, global acquisitions where you're really changing the footprint of your organization. You've got all the divestitures and acquisitions, all of that kind of work that goes along. Executive teams change during those kinds of time. And the people that got you here were not the people that could get you there. And there are times when everybody's like, I think it's time that this particular person should go. And this sounds a bit odd, perhaps. But one of the things that I learned from Mike is, what does it mean to let people go gracefully? What does it mean? Everybody understands, even the person in most cases, like, okay, this isn't working out. How do you treat somebody when they're going out the door? I've probably learned as much about leadership watching Mike in those situations as I have in anything else. And sometimes, frankly, there were people that more than deserved to go. So what does it mean to treat people with dignity when they don't deserve it, when they're making some really bad choices? Mike is a huge influence in my life in a lot of ways. So that's the first one. The other one I'm going to pull from the world of sports, and it's a guy named Brad Stevens. Brad is currently the general manager for the Boston Celtics in the NBA here. He seems to have a very clear understanding and articulates it very well in terms of what we're talking about today. Being a person who is grounded but understands that, and it's funny, he's in a very public facing role, general manager of an iconic brand here in the States, akin to if you want to talk about Man U and Manchester City. I'm not trying to start a fight here today. I'm just saying, over here in the States, these are the sports brands, and the Celtics are one of the top ones. But Brad has an incredible story, and he is somebody that shows up very grounded and sees other people as human beings. And so I see that as well. And then the third one for me comes from a place of faith. When I look at the scriptures and at the life of Jesus, it's amazing to me to see the story of inwardly sound and others focused over and over again. And so when I look for inspiration, when I look for examples, those are three different people that come to mind.
And I guess that sits well with kind of things like morals and ethics, and also around kindness, doesn't it? Because from faith we do get kindness, and
Yes.
people sort of look to others in that way.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, we're talking about courage. Like,
Mm.
kindness is really an important word, and I think because it isn't kind when we spare people the feedback they need to hear. It's actually, if I could just go off here a little bit, it's actually incredibly selfish when, for the sake of our own emotional comfort, we don't tell the other person, the folks that we're leading, about the underperformance that they're showing up with. Now, of course, there is a way to do that, to do it well, to do it with tact, to do it with care. And I think, for those of us that maybe have trouble delivering these messages, you'd be surprised at how open somebody is to hearing change feedback they need to hear if they know that it's coming from somebody who is for them as a person. You're for me, and I may not agree with everything that you're saying, but it's not usually a hostile interaction if I am convinced that the person is for me. But if they don't know that, if they haven't seen you be for them, then that difficult conversation can become much more difficult.
Mm.
But that courage for us to step into being others focused enough to say, hey, we need to talk about this. Here's the other thing that I'll share with everybody that I've personally experienced. When we are able to move ourselves into a place of kind of past the initial frustration of somebody's underperformance, because usually when somebody's underperforming, it's affecting our lives as well. It's like, you're actively making my life difficult, so I'm pissed off. When I can pause and get to a little, in my life, what I would call a healthier place, and say, okay, you are making my life difficult, but how can I be for you? How can I be for you? And if I've had the luxury of time, which you don't always have, to say, let me get into my mind and heart to be for you. And then we have the corrective conversation. It's been amazing about how I saw the need for my own courage lower because it wasn't as difficult. When I knew that I was for the other person, then metaphorically, we're sitting on the same side of the table looking at the problem instead of opposite one another adversarially, where I am saying, hey, what's going on? And so there's a freedom that I would just invite everybody to consider, is if we could be for the person, even though maybe they're frustrating us, you will find, I believe, that corrective conversation is easier for you when you know that you're for the other person. And also, if the other person believes that you're for them, it becomes more receptive. So, yes, we need to be courageous, but when we're really for other people, I actually think it requires not as much courage, because we get to lean into the fact that we're for them. It becomes a little bit of an easier conversation. That's just kind of get to the very, how does who connect with what?
Yeah.
How does being inwardly sound, others focused connect with, for example, developing talent? That story that I just unpacked, that's why Who Not What exists, because we develop talent better when we're grounded in ourselves and for the other person. They're more receptive when we're grounded and for them. That's how it ultimately shows up in real life, not just in some theory or in some research.
Yeah, because the who and the what then leads naturally into the how we do it, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely it does.
And one of the lessons I learned, Tim, a long time ago was to always lead with praise and sincere appreciation for the qualities you admire in the person first, right?
Yeah.
This is what I
Yeah.
really like about you. This is what I see you doing exceptionally well. When I was at your stage, I had this challenge, draw their attention to the area you'd like them to improve because you led with praise, right? You're for them.
One of the things when you think about a circle, and this is not original to me, and I'm all of a sudden I'm blanking on the book that I read it in. So I'm just whoever I need to give credit to. I can't remember right now, but I want you to imagine a pie chart of the ways that number of ways that you can do something, and let's say that 90% of them are incorrect and 10% are correct. It's actually more efficient and more functionally effective if you had to pick one or the other, whether you're going to kind of negatively criticize the wrong moves or praise the right ones. You should pick praise the right ones. It's far more effective because if somebody lands in that 10% and then you stand up and cheer, you got a pretty good chance that that's going to happen again. If somebody lands in the wrong spot and you just say, hey, that was wrong with no other like, well, you're going to have to do that 89 more times in order to get them into the pie wedge. One time with the group, we ran this experiment. We played essentially a game we call here in the States hot and cold. We hid something in the room. We had about 150 people in the room. And we said, okay, with 2 people out of the room, when they come in, the first person, we're just going to boo and hiss every time they go in the wrong direction. And it was very entertaining because we had a camera on them that was projected up on the screen so we could see their facial expression the whole time. So they go the wrong direction, boo. They go the next wrong direction. We did that the whole time. That person said about a minute and a half in, literally said out loud, I don't want to do this anymore.
Wow.
I want to quit. Eventually found the object that we had hidden in the room in 2.5 minutes. Then we brought the next person in and did just the opposite. All we did is cheer when she went in the right direction towards the object. Object was in the exact same place, and she found the object in 45 seconds.
Wow.
This is the power. I'm not saying that I just got done saying we need to give the difficult and hard feedback. But to your point, if we're emotionally leading people, which by the way, I'll just say to everybody, I know you see yourselves as the strategic leaders of your departments and organizations. You're also the emotional leader of your department. And so thinking about how do we, in a very authentic, please don't say wonderful job tying your shoes today. You'll lose all credibility. Our praise has to be authentic. But if we can keep in mind the power of reinforcement, we get a great chance to get reoccurring actions that we would definitely hope for.
Tim, that's so helpful. The fact that you put it into a very simple task that anybody could replicate, right? That
Yes.
exercise of finding the thing in the room, anyone could do that.
Give it a go. Give it a go and watch what happens. Then you have to apologize to the person you booed at the first because they're gonna have a little mini emotional scar. But yeah, it's okay. You can. It'll be worth it, and you can buy them lunch afterwards, and it'll be okay.
Excellent. 35 minutes in, and I'm sure there's a few questions coming through. And I know Steve is so attentive, he'll have a question for you for sure, Tim. So thank you so much for my part. I'm going to hand you back to Steve just now.